I have a mic. Okay, good. All right, so Mehdi gave like a perfect intro in terms of like, thinking of capabilities and all that stuff, so I don't really need to do this anymore. Thank you. Just kidding. Good job, buddy. No, so I'm Jason, as Mehdi said, CTO at Stoplight. There's a list of other stuff here, which is really just to say for the last 10 or 15 years, working on APIs, API programs, back-end engineer, product manager, executive, done kind of all the API things. But the most relevant thing for today's talk is for the last little over a year, I've been hosting the API Intersection podcast. It is, paid for by Stoplight, but it's very much a community effort to kind of learn primarily from people who are kind of leading these either transformation efforts or standing up some kind of API program at a variety of different scales and industries of kind of what works, right? And sometimes, hopefully, what doesn't. So my quick shill, and we'll be done with it. Stoplight is a collaborative API design platform. In essence, we help companies who are looking to kind of drive that change across the organization, grow their program. Typically, this is focusing on not only design, but governance, and there's all these other things like mocking, visibility, all that. So I've done my marketing job, and we'll move on. So the first bit is, the most common thing is not really looking at APIs as a business asset first, and looking at it as a technical thing. So we'll kind of walk through some of this stuff. So right out of the gate is like, when you're thinking about this for your companies, how do you explain why it matters? One of my favorite articles from the last year was a recap of a study done by Marshall Van Alstyne, who, along with Sangeet Chaudhary, wrote one of my favorite books ever, Platform Revolution. If you've never read it, it is not a technical-oriented thing, a lot more about marketplace design. But they did a study looking at the last 16 years of companies that kind of leaned into APIs versus those that didn't. And so for me, it's been very validating that we finally have real academic study data showing why this is such an advantage. On that 16-year period, those companies that leaned into it were showing 38% more growth on average. So I think for folks who are sort of challenged with how do we explain to leadership why these things matter, for years it's been, trust me, it's going to be great. And now we have the data to really show that this is a strong competitive advantage. The other thing I always try to set context with folks on is platform means a lot of things, right? And it's at least two in my mind that come out of kind of two schools of thought. The first, this notion of the composable business, or what in architecture circles we would call kind of our, our distributed architecture, or insert a number of other keywords there. Which is to say, everyone loves the Lego or puzzle piece kind of abstraction. This is what I call the MIT school of thought. The other side of platform is really the idea that, you're building a marketplace. So when everyone in business circles loves talking about, sort of the Ubers and things like that, where they go, oh, we got supply and demand dynamics. It's important to recognize, first off, that these can be mutually exclusive things. So you could be building a composable business and not necessarily a marketplace. If you subscribe to sort of Platform Revolution and that whole line of thinking, everything is a marketplace if you look at it right, a little sideways. But it's important to recognize which of those things you're trying to accomplish. And what I've seen many, many, many times is there are two different parts of your organization that are trying to accomplish those two things and aren't really swapping notes. And getting those two things in alignment is kind of the magic, right? Of how do you grow a marketplace in the right way and build composability into your architecture that actually aligns in a strategy. So this is all just the overview thing, and now we'll kind of get into, okay, if you're thinking about this as a product, what are some things? And this is really not meant to be a guidebook or comprehensive. This was some highlights that we ask almost everyone on the podcast, great, cool stuff, where would you get started, what's most important? And from those kind of product-oriented thinkers, these were some of the highlights that came out. And I think for me, the thing that I've always thought of, and I've riffed with podcast guests multiple times, is it's just another product, first of all. And I think this is where people get tripped up in thinking, well, it's this highly technical asset, and it's got developers using it, and I don't know how to use them at all, and so it must be another thing. Or we're building a feature, and there's an item on the bullet list that says API. But that's not how you manage a product, right? That's a requirement on some other product, and the API is the product now. So how do we manage products? We know how to do that, and the key here is that it's just a little different, right? So I think stepping back from all this a little bit, we know that out of the gate, you may be doing this to compose your business. You may be doing this to build a marketplace. But bottom line is you need to start with understanding what are the relationships. You also need to make sure that the folks, hopefully at the top of the company, are bought into why this is so important to how it may change the way you operate as a business. And then finally, and far less heady, and like one slide will be quick, we'll just talk about why testing is different. And I think it's so important for product managers to recognize this. So recognizing relationships, and this is really, I think over the years at, the 10 years of API conferences we've done, a lot of folks have said that, entering into using an API from someone else is about beginning a relationship. There's a lot of trust that goes into building your business on someone else's capabilities. So why not start there? So I think of this as kind of constituents. Who is going to be using this thing and for what purpose? So that is to say that you need to have a customer-centric mindset. So the way that, I think hopefully if you've sat in on enough sessions, you've heard folks talk about have this capability-oriented view of things. Meta use the same terms here. The way I've always put it to folks is talk about what it is that you do and draw it in simple terms on the board in a way that if you brought a customer in to talk about it, they would look and say, yes, those are my things. I understand that, right? If you have acronyms and all these weird system jargon things, you're probably doing it wrong. But this is going a step deeper than that to say, what are their needs, right? This is old school product management. What's the job to be done, right? Stuff like this. It still works. It's just a different audience. If you don't know who's going to use it, if you already have folks using it, the opposite, go look at that usage. What are they doing with it, right? Are they doing silly things, which happens a lot, right? Does someone have an infinite loop deployed that you didn't know about and they're getting blocked all the time? Sure. But look at those patterns of usage, not necessarily just frequency. Which things are they calling in what order? But the data won't tell you everything. Find out who uses it a lot or does it in an interesting way, and go find out what they're trying to accomplish, right? You do this with any product. You go talk to the customer, right? And if you're not, you should. And finally, and this is where we get really to the relationship thing. Okay, so you've talked to people who are using or you might think use it. Really start thinking, is this a customer using the API? Is this a partner using the API? Like, how is this going to break down? Because those worlds are very different. So like in an integration partner scenario, are they going to need consent from your users? Now you're in the OAuth game, right? And that is not an easy lift at a lot of places. I mean, it's certainly everywhere I've ever been, it's like the long pole in the tent, getting the identity stack in a good place. If it's just customers getting their own data, okay, well, that might be easier. You might be able to get around some of the identity complexities, and now you're just dealing with some simple tokens. But is it that they want raw data, or are they looking for insight? Are they looking for aggregation, right? But point being is right from the start, a partner type scenario versus a customer getting their own data kind of situation is a very different thing. And the reason why you would do that as a company is going to have incredibly different outcomes, right? So start with the relationships. And this is, again, coming back to product managers. Know your customer. So if you're managing an API product, go know the customer. And to be clear, that is not necessarily, send your developers to go talk to their developers. Sure, that's good. And I think most folks already do that. Go talk to their business folks. Why would they bother investing their engineering time to build something that we'll call your API? You need to understand that, right? Because you need to figure out what are your success measures going to be. And this is where many, many, many places go super sideways in thinking of this as a technical implementation detail and using technical measures. Well, if you're a product manager managing an API, or even if you're not a product manager and you're an architect playing like product manager because no one's hired one, or that sort of thing, know how you're going to measure its success before you go build it. And that should be in business terms, of course. So part of the reason I point this out is in a lot of places, if you're saying, all right, time to have an API strategy, right? Great, let's figure out everything, all the possible ways in which APIs will be used. And I would highly suggest, from the business standpoint, start with what are the relationship types that are strategically most important? And that may be about adding incremental revenue. That may be about adding network effects to take the value you already have and amplify it. It may be about growing relationships with other players in your ecosystem. Whatever it is, pick one of those relationship types and focus on it, rather than trying to figure out everything all at once, right? API strategy work is full of ocean boiling opportunities, and I think this is the biggest way to segment that as a starting point. Which sets up nicely for a signal we clearly see across customers at Stoplight who have successful programs is they have executives who are bought in. I myself have led the band of rebels at various companies in trying to sort of go, I know we need to do this, and we're going to get some folks together and get a root of the idea started, which is great. But at some point, you got to get funding. You got to get broader support. You need kind of the mandate. And I don't mean the Jeff Bezos story everyone loves to tell of thou shalt build APIs or thou shalt be fired or whatever. Like, there was a lot more to that story, right? I'm saying that from a business standpoint, you can explain why these APIs exist and what the outcomes they're going to produce, and that aligns with what the business's strategy is. And if it's not, work on steering that conversation toward why it should, if you're not already in that game. I'm going to say it again over and over. It's just another product, right? Apply traditional product management thinking. It's just a different set of constituents, a different set of outcomes than you would typically see with your point-and-click style product. And it's about driving that relevance. Why does this exist? So some of this, I'll admit, is probably pointed at maybe some of your architect types who find themselves in the position of trying to advocate for why do we have all this API stuff? Why do we want to invest more? I think in some cases, there are product folks who face this as well. But ultimately, it's like, how do you build a business case for this? And this is where we're coming back to, what is the way in which we operate? Frame it in that, right? The technical implementation of people calling APIs, it's just a tool, right? Why does it exist? Why do you need to do it? This one's important. So quite often, the measures of success in a company that isn't very connected, isn't maybe very open, or doesn't have a lot of kind of connections with other platforms, is there might be a very simple measure that is very sort of pipeline thinking in its nature. So I'll pick on travel industry. You might see conversion, right? Can we convert? Can we get a ticket sold? But when you start looking at a broader ecosystem of how all those things connect, you might say, that's not really what you're ending up selling, right? You're selling a trip, you're selling an experience. So how can we change the way that we look at success to include that broader ecosystem? And I know there's probably not a lot of travel folks. I'm just, past experience. So the next bit is I already said it before, the technical measures are a mistake almost every time. I can't tell you of one time I've ever talked to folks looking at how they measured success of their APIs and said it's the API calls. That's what figured it all out for us, right? The number of times that the API was called was how successful we were. Only if you're in a sort of very simple, say when I was at PayPal, you could probably say every time that complete payment transaction API got called. Sure, you could probably use that measure, but kind of wanted to know how much it was for. Right? Already said that. So call back to the marketplace thing from before is marketplace constructs often have a lot of indirect monetization factors. So it's not as simple as I call the payment API, I complete a payment, how much was it? you've often got engagement factors that are proxies to potential growth, right? Because of the network effects involved. So, I'll always kind of point folks to say, like, it's easy to say positive network effects, but quantifying it in engagement factors is hard work. And building enough trust in those engagement factors to know that they will lead to some monetization or commercial success takes historical evidence to build that trust in those engagement proxies. And this is another one of those cases where when you start thinking about things in supply and demand versus simple transactional operation, you may have very different measures as to what indicates or what is a leading metric that could indicate trailing measure success. So back to the beginning, know if you're just trying to be more modular or be more composable versus you want to change the dynamics of how you do business into a marketplace, because the measures are a whole different ballgame. This is the thing that I think historically I've seen a lot of, and I feel like it's less and less these days, as there are more sort of executive and management folks who recognize the value in this, or they've at least seen it in some business journal and they want someone to tell them why. But if you don't have that business perspective around sort of API projects, it is the easiest thing in the world to kill, right? And the easiest thing to kind of go, stop doing that because we don't understand why you're doing it. Pretty easy to say, but again, it's just there's a trail of bodies of dead API projects from not doing this kind of homework. So back to kind of what I've said before, that if your API is a bullet point on some other deliverable, you're absolutely doing it wrong. And this is what I think is endemic in product management teams. This is not a tech artifact. This is not a commodity. And the best way I can explain this to folks who maybe are here for this conference going like, I'm overwhelmed with all this technical sounding stuff, is if you handed a user experience to a bunch of engineers and said, build a great experience, you'd get an engineered experience, right? It probably wouldn't be a well-designed experience. We've all seen this before, right? It's the same thing with APIs. In the same way that late 90s, early 2000s, we saw, sort of UI design turn into UX design, right? Taking kind of a bigger picture look at the overall experience. You hear people say developer experience, that's what we're getting at. Is the same kind of change in thinking is happening, is design that experience for developers. But this all comes back to, did you know what they were trying to accomplish in the first place, right? Have empathy as a designer. And API design is not like other fields of design in some ways, but this is also to say that it is actually, if you sit down and look at what makes great designs, starts with empathy. That same empathy is what, as a product manager, you might lean on someone who understands the field of API design to any extent to lend that developer empathy, but the product folks need to understand what the business outcome is, right? So putting those things together is what's going to end up with something that's customer-centric in nature, and that's what succeeds. So I could swap out API on here and put user experience, and it would all make sense, right? It's just another product. All right, so to tone down from all the heady, pithy stuff and get into something much easier, which I think for the technical folks in here, you'll just kind of go, of course. But I think for product managers is not often recognized, is within your team when you're building APIs, you have no excuse to not sign off on something with confidence, because this is the most testable thing you're ever going to build as a product, right? It is a programmatic interface. And what that means is you can write tests against it with absolute precision. So every possible scenario you can think of should be testable. Now, granted, there's a reasonable line of how far you should go. I understand that. But the point is it doesn't have the ambiguity of these kind of brittle user experiences, these point-and-click interfaces that are really hard to test with any certainty. APIs are innately testable. And so the way you should think about it, at the beginning of that story, before you're building something, preferably in a scenario-based format. I've always been a fan of kind of cucumber-style things. There's a lot of options out there now. Build out the scenario of calls that do the job. Quite often, one API call doesn't do the job, right? I'll take a payments example from my past. You can't make a credit card transaction without an authorization. It's at least 2 calls, and you have to identify who they were. There's probably at least 3, right? Have that scenario built up, and when your team starts building, everything's red. And when you're done, everything's green, and you say, I'm signed off, thank you, right? That's the way that you can really have sign off with confidence, even if you're not coming from a development background, so that you've got a customer-centric set of language that describes what the thing is that we're going to build, the job that it's going to do, and everything's green. And you know that when it goes out, it's tested, right? At least, certainly unit tests and all those things below it are a whole other concern. But at least that functionally, the thing does what you think it does, right? It does the job that you think it should do for the customer. Which is, I'll loop back here too to say that there's really no excuse with APIs why if something happened, something escaped, right? You end up with a bug that you didn't think through. There's no reason to push that back out without an accompanying test, because again, it's innately testable. And you shouldn't have the sort of story of, like you do with many UXs, well, that's going to take manual testing, right? There's almost never an excuse with an API that you need manual testing. I said almost. So that's pretty much all the interesting tidbits here, and just a plug for the podcast to say, wherever you listen to podcasts, API Intersection, have a listen, and if you have interesting things to say about things that you're working on in APIs, reach out. We have guests of all different walks, and we'll continue to do so. And that leaves us with over 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason. Do you have any questions on the talk? I see no scratch.
I forgot to ask at the beginning, are there any people in here that are actually doing API product? Okay, the ones that were smiling, good.
and who has direct monetization strategies, just to ask? Indirect? None? Okay, no, interesting. Interesting.
Actually, I do have a question.
Yeah. Almost right.
So in our organization, I'm sure a lot of people are on this journey where it's not as clear-cut as, hey, there's an API, number of times you call it, you pay us, or some sort of subscription model that's just for the API. We have a hodgepodge of things, products and services that we've basically given to our partners for years and years now. And so the challenge becomes, how do we bring APIs as an offering to them and kind of monetize it without saying, hey, this is just more money you'll have to give us?
Are you in a SaaS business? So I think for me, like, that business question of, we have all these APIs, we're connected to these other platforms, people are building things against our APIs, why do we do all this? It's expensive. The first cohort that I'll always look at is, what does retention look like on that user cohort that's integrated versus those that aren't historically? And I can almost promise you it's going to be drastically better. That's a great starting point to kind of justify why to integrate a SaaS platform. And the other perspective to bring to that is, the users that sign up via an integration, like their LTV, retention, all those factors tend to be drastically higher because you are part of a workflow. And this is another thing that when you really think about what is the job the customer's doing, not what does this API do, you're probably part of a chain of events. And if you know what kind of the input and output of your platform is and the part that you play in a bigger workflow, if you're not part of that workflow, you are probably drastically lower value. And this goes back to that mindset that, users come for the values, stay for the network. What network are you part of, right? Building that story is a good defensibility. Now, I think where you go from there with, should we monetize further and all that sort of stuff, certainly you can go from there, but at least being in a position that you understand what the effect is on user retention is just a critical place to start, especially if you're in a high churn business.
So we have an online question, like, should all APIs must be treated as product? should all APIs must be treated as product in an organization?
All APIs be treated as product.
Even though whatever backend, ERP, whatever interface, facade, or whatever, should all APIs must be treated as product?
Sort of. So I think there are, let's say, sort of utility things, right? And the internal versus external API thing, I think the way I look at this is you try to default to the position that you are building a capability for your company, and you should always be asking the question, is there some imaginable scenario in which there would be external use for this? And folks will go, well, our customers, we would never have access to them for that. But what about partners you might not be thinking about now, right? What about different forms of aggregation for that data that could be useful? So this is to say that design to externalize and having someone with a product mindset, at least who understands how to manage API products, is a good starting point. But there's always going to be stuff that isn't that important. But I think it's a bad idea, to say this a different way, to say that, well, this is all the internal garbage that we don't really apply any customer-centric thinking to, and this is the baling wire and duct tape that we use to put things out externally. That's a mistake. You're just breeding problems that you will not be able to escape. So companies that really accelerate out of this customer-centric, product-oriented API thinking is in part because they're able to build one core capability that has portable utility both internally within the company as well as to customers and a network of partners. If you can master all those things in one thing, yeah, you probably need to think about it like a product, right? But I guess to say it a third way is think in capabilities and how you manage that portfolio of capabilities. Take some level of product thinking, even if it's not necessarily writing user stories and all the kind of traditional product owner sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Really windy answer, sorry. Complicated question.
Last question here. We have 1 minute.
You talked about UX and involvement. So as we look forward, after you minimize risk, outage, bugs, what would be the evolution of API?
What's the evolution of API? From which perspective exactly? Yeah.
You have 20 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly the perspective out there that the no-code thing is going to change everything, right? And that if we have easy-to-use APIs that are well-designed, that are friendly to all constituents, not just the developers, that we'll have this proliferation of great ideas. And I'm skeptical, to be honest, and that is to say that I think I've worked with enough people over the last 25 years that have built great software, that I've seen the talent that it takes to know how to build something great. And the idea that anyone off the street can just point, click, and create something great, I'm highly skeptical of. But I do think that may potentially reduce the cost and reduce the pressure on sort of dyed-in-the-wool hardcore engineers for some of the easier things to solve for. Obviously, some of GraphQL, there's a lot of magical thinking in that cool, now we don't have to build or think about how to rationalize our capabilities. We'll just point this thing at our database and we'll just throw the database over HTTP and it'll be great. And there's just many historical examples, like my favorite being Sparkle and RDF, right? That was going to be, the semantic web will change everything. But it turned out that having disparate data sources distributed over the internet, trying to do queries across all that stuff, is almost impossible to make performant in all of these serendipitous ways. So it's where I also have some skepticism on full stack GraphQL. That said, if you're doing backend for front end kind of stuff, one-off services to do craft some particular experience, then that's probably a bad idea. That's where GraphQL is perfect. And there's certainly a lot of data usage scenarios for more, let's say, internal stuff where you can constrain the usage to more predictable paths, where you can optimize that query path in reasonable fashion and constrain things. But that said, there may be some magic that ensues out of folks who are really good at crafting just that right model to have just the right amount of optimization to make things like GraphQL work full stack. But that's not, the evidence isn't showing that so far.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you.
Sorry, Wendy answers.